We are starting with a follow-up today. Friday, we told you about the deadline for all Idaho agencies to submit what 1% and 2% budget cuts could look like. The JFAC co-chairs made their request as they try and decide what they're going to do with Idaho's budget. Now, as we previously reported, this comes after JFAC leader Josh Tanner criticized the governor's proposed budget, calling it a budget with gimmicks that he believes won't work. So JFAC is weighing cuts to make sure there's a balanced budget. All right, Joe, we hear about these cuts often, but you crunched those numbers and you're also digging into some of the implications for some of those agencies if they have to make these cuts.
Right, and a good point that you make there. These are proposed cuts right now. So to reiterate, Idaho lawmakers on the budgeting committee, JFAC, they could soon consider additional 1% and 2% budget cuts for the next 2 fiscal years. This adds to the 3% holdbacks that Governor Little ordered by executive action last year. And state agencies say that while the numbers may sound small, the real-world impacts could be significant, affecting education, job training, healthcare access, public safety, and communities across the state. A few subheadings to dig into. 2 main ones: public safety and education. The Idaho Department of Correction, IDOC, that's the prison system, they reports that furloughs would force prisons to operate in a modified secure status, keeping many inmates locked down without access to required education and rehab programs. Meanwhile, the Idaho State Police reports that even a 1% reduction in their budget would require furloughing all troopers and eliminating Capitol Protective Services, and it really also impacts security at the state capitol in terms of response to protests and public events. They say at ISP, a 2% reduction would increase furlough hours and staffing losses. By fiscal year 27, additional cuts, they say, could eliminate ISP's SWAT team, reduce their forensic lab capacity, and slow criminal investigations as well as court cases statewide. Now, education cuts saw responses from all the higher education programs, so we'll just use Boise State as an example, similar though across the board. Boise State reports that further cuts to their institution would force them to pause hiring faculty in high-demand fields like nursing, engineering, construction management, and education, even as they say student demand continues to rise. This would mean fewer available seats in popular programs, longer times for people to graduate, and delayed entry into the workforce in Idaho. Meanwhile, graduate medical education programs, which train doctors in Idaho, they warn that additional cuts are not workable in their programs. They say, by the way, Idaho currently ranks last in the nation for physicians per capita, and residency programs are a key part of the state's strategy to recruit and retain doctors. Originally, K through 12 public schools weren't going to be impacted by the cuts, but JFAC leaders reversed course last week, asking the state superintendent of public instruction for the same reduction plans that they asked all other agencies to submit. But Superintendent Debbie Critchfield didn't submit a plan, instead sending JFAC this letter saying she will not be recommending more cuts to the budget for the current fiscal year or next fiscal year. Morgan Romero sat down with her to find out why.
What prompted you to submit this letter last week rather than responding to JFAC's ask to submit that revised budget?
I wanted to remind JFAC that I had already done it. So the assignment had already been fulfilled. I was the one, I am a constitutional officer, but I'm also over an agency that had revised their budget in early December to make the changes. We saw what the projections were. We saw all the information that had changed from when I first submitted in August. And so we took some things off. We made some changes. And the whole idea around that was so that if there were additional changes to be made, that we put forward the best budget.
Outline for me what it would look like to really shave off that money from your budget for the current and the next fiscal year.
Mid-year would for sure be more devastating than moving on. But even now, as districts are looking at putting their budgets together for next year, we're talking about hiring freezes, declarations of financial emergency so that they can go into contracts. It looks like larger class sizes. It looks like program elimination. It looks like removing instructional and intervention supports for our earliest learners, particularly in reading. And we've made so much progress in so many of these areas that that I hate to see us go back. Career tech programs, shop classes are some of the most expensive classes. And I do believe that there is a disproportionate negative impact on our rural schools because of the fact that they just have tighter margins. Everyone's got tight margins, but our rural schools have even tighter margins there. And so looking at numbers, okay, you can look at numbers and say, holy smokes, the public schools budget, I mean, it's over $3 billion. Certainly, there are places to cut. Go talk to your neighborhood teacher or your neighborhood principal and ask them what they've already cut and what we're already doing without, and it becomes alive. It's not just a number on a piece of paper, but it really is about kids in the classroom.
So even though lawmakers and the governor repeatedly said that the public schools budget was going to stay flat and not face reductions, Superintendent Critchfield says she willingly cut some places to get in front of this very issue. Already, she dropped her request for $50 million in additional special education funding for next fiscal year, despite what she says in this letter to JFAC as, quote, growing financial pressure on local districts and charters to provide federally required services for our highest needs students. Now, Critchfield says Idaho school districts are already very efficient with spending. So rather than cutting spending and doing more with less, she says this is actually a prime opportunity to talk about changing the public schools funding formula, modernizing it, making it right for 21st century schools. Additionally, I know, Joe, you've covered this extensively. Yeah. This is a conversation going back and forth right now with Idaho lawmakers. Is it a revenue problem? Is it a spending problem? How did we get here? Critchfield, and I asked her that question, she says, you know, lawmakers have to figure this out ASAP because she keeps hearing the same exact conversation.
Yeah, and going back to the funding formula, that was something that Critchfield and Wendy Horman, formerly of the legislature, pitched last year as a major overhaul. It lost traction towards the end of the session, and then nothing happened in the end. So it is a major question, and I appreciate, too, what Superintendent Critchfield saying, not trying to put words in her mouth, but regardless of what the problem is, you can point fingers all day. You have to make changes to avoid the situation. And I also have heard a conversation in the education world about, in the Idaho Constitution, you need a fully funded, uniform, standardized, public school system. What does that look like? I've heard some folks weigh in that, well, even if you keep flat with inflation, it kind of cuts that way.
She wrote the exact same thing in her letter. Like, you cannot touch the public schools budget, but in times of inflation, keeping it flat is a cut. Yeah.
It's the way you look at it. It's super complicated, too.
I'll be honest. It's a lot. It's a lot. And when you go through the spreadsheets of the other departments, it's a lot as well. And looking at how those numbers translate, 1% to 2% may not sound like a lot, but it's tens of millions of dollars for these agencies.
I mean, we had a viewer just last week mention infrastructure. I mean, that's a whole nother can of worms when it comes to schools right now.
And something I wanted to add on, too, that Morgan touched on, this is budgets that are in the current year, by the way. We're in fiscal year 2026. So for fiscal year 27, cutting out of what your ask is for is one thing. Not to use a lazy comparison here, but you're building the plane while you're flying it for a bunch of agencies.
Exactly.
Tough.
And for school districts, that looks like not sending money out currently in the current school year.
It's a tough situation. Guys, thank you.
You bet.